They're studying Noah and the ark tonight, as well as you guys. Why don't you go with the teals? You're going to go back over here. Noah's ark's over here. This is a classroom y'all have never been in before. I know. It's the greatest thing ever. Why do you have to be last? It's just the luck of the draw tonight. Josh, get out of here. I love you. Get out of here. See, I got to say that tonight. Didn't even have kids sing. And for the rest of you wonderful people, our brother, the Lord's servant, Mr. Jerry.
This thing's on wheels, right?
Yes, sir. Oh, sorry.
That's convenient. Hope everyone was able to work off some of that potluck food. Get ready for some Bible study tonight. We are going to be talking about some of the bad news. First lesson today was about the good news, creation. As God planned it, the ideal. We're going to talk about not only the first sin today, but also some of the other ones to come after. So if you'd like to open your Bibles to Genesis 3, we'll be kind of looking at some of the stories throughout this. I'll say again what I said this morning. There's too much in this for me to possibly cover even everything I wanted to. So if you have something you want to talk about or a question that you've always wondered, feel free to go there. And I'm happy to spend time there. If you've got a question or something you want to talk about, probably someone else does too. So everything is ideal in the garden. God has set up the world perfectly, mature, ready for people. Sun, moon, and stars shine down, keep everything in their season. The garden is well watered. There's no weeds and thorns. Animals all like each other and get along. Adam's got Eve. It's all good, right? We said this morning, God set up boundaries. Here's where the garden is. You care for it in there. And he set up rules. Don't touch that tree in the middle. And along with that, he gave humans a task. Tend the garden, care for creation. And so that was the ideal setting, what God wanted, but it certainly doesn't take long for Satan to come in and mess some things up. So the serpent, using later scriptures, we understand this is who we come to know as Satan or the devil. He has his own plans, right? He's crafty, he's devious. John tells us he was the first liar and a liar from the beginning. Let's think a little bit about how he operates, though. Just thinking about some of the stories, whether it be this first temptation, whether it be how he works with the sin, with what's going to happen with Cain and Abel, and even just how he works with the world in the time of Noah, which are the kind of the three stories we're covering. How does Satan work? Half-truths, good. Deception, right?
Against us.
Yeah, he is our adversary. That is in the actual, the word used. It's really almost more of a title than a proper first name, which actually God's name in the Old Testament a lot of times is Yahweh, which is also a title. So it's not like a first name sort of a thing. But this idea of deceiving means that for most people, Satan doesn't just stroll in and tell you, "Hey, I'm here to lead you in the wrong direction." You know, and that's part of why what he does is so insidious, is because by its very nature, he's not open about it. He's not upfront about it. Think for a moment, what was the first thing God made? Light. And in light, there is no darkness at all, right? You probably know that whole thing. If you've been in a cave somewhere, it's completely dark. They let your eyes adjust to complete darkness, and then they light a match. And just a tiny little bit of light means it's impossible for there to be dark anymore. It just doesn't happen. Right? God is light. There is no darkness in him at all. It's not possible. But Satan, he is sneaky, he's deceptive, he's got tricks, schemes, plots, plans. And he doesn't reveal his full motives, right? Anything else we learn about how Satan operates here? someone had mentioned like half-truths. What in this story is kind of a half-truth?
He says you're going to die, but God said that you would die.
Yeah? So, kind of counteracting some of God's commands. And maybe he means that, oh, you won't die right away or something like that, right? What else?
In that particular case, he's changing the definition. So he may use the same words, but he gives those words a different meaning.
Yeah. And for the moment they partook of that fruit, they started to die, didn't they? Mortality entered their existence where it had not before. And maybe they had one idea of what die means, and he thought another. Now, there's part of what he says which is appealing. What is appealing about what Satan offers? So, go ahead.
Can you be like God?
Yeah. And was that the truth? In the idea that they would have a sense of right and wrong and some of those things and understanding? Yeah, he was right. But when he kind of impugns God motives and makes God out to be the bad guy in the story, almost like God doesn't want to share this, he doesn't want you to have it, there's where the half-truth comes in. So he can even use part of the truth. Think back to how he operated with Jesus' temptations, right? That second one, he even used some scripture. And those are true scriptures, and in context, they're absolutely true. But they miss the whole point of what God's doctrine was. That's kind of how he can use things that have truth in them. This is why the whole truth is important, and investigation into the truth and digging a little deeper, right? Any other thoughts about what he does here? Go ahead.
Satan can't create anything on his own, so he has to manipulate what God's already created or put into existence. So, he told them that they would be like God, knowing good and evil, and essentially trying to imply that they were lacking something, but they were already perfect. So it's kind of like a flip where it's like you're actually defiling yourself when you think that you're gaining something that you already have.
Yeah. And he does. He takes and twists and corrupts God's creation, God's words, things that have been made, right? And think about sins. Like, a lot of the sins start out as a desire or something that's a natural thing put into us. I mean, when a baby is born, they're born with that desire to, give me. Give me. And that's not sinful. It's not bad. That's literal survival instinct built into it. But later on, growth and maturity teaches them, well, I can't have everything I want when I want it right now. That's not how the world works. But greed sort of turns that on its head. I want this right now. Think about sexual sins. It's good in its proper context in marriage where God put it, but God twists those things and makes a good creation into something that is twisted and evil, right? And fill in the blank, every sin is really some manipulation, some lie, some deception, and it catches us up. And if it wasn't appealing, why would we even do it, right? If we could see the after effects of how bad sin would be, what does he point out to Eve here? Genesis 3. What did the tree and the fruit look like? Look good, right? Nice to look at. That's something shiny. We have that. We focus on shiny things, good-looking things. And we don't see the danger. And so they were not really looking through and trusting God. See, sometimes we have to trust our parents. These things are not good for you. We don't understand it. It's shiny, it looks good. And our Heavenly Father's just saying, He tells us some things aren't good for us. And sometimes we just got to trust His word on that, right? We get ourselves into a world of hurt if we don't. So he actually only deceives Eve. I think there's a situation here where God has just at the end of chapter 2 basically told man to lead a family and to guide his family. They're one flesh. And he deceives Eve, but then she just hands it to Adam and he just takes it. There's no deception involved. He just goes right along with it. The New Testament kind of talks about that as well. Go ahead.
It goes through the whole Bible, the whole thing of the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And he hits all three of them right there
Yeah,
in his deception.
that's right. Yeah, it looks good. You could be like God.
Tastes good.
Yeah, there's something for you in it. God Satan kind of hits all the three negative categories.
Same thing he did when he had Christ in the wilderness.
Yeah.
He hit him with all three.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting, that's the way he's always operated. Sometimes we think we're smarter than him. One of this interesting polls I saw maybe a couple of years ago, it was something like, 70 or 80% of Christians believed in angels, but only like 50% believed in Satan at that time. So isn't that kind of funny? People are pretty willing to believe in angels and spiritual beings that help us, but they're not really that willing to believe in a dark force that's out to get us. They'd rather not think about it or talk about it or even believe it. So he's good at deceiving. In Corinthians, we're told he disguises himself as an angel of light, right? So let's talk about consequences of sin. So Eve gets deceived here in Genesis 3. She hands it over to Adam, and he eats as well. What are the immediate consequences? Yes, eventually they will die, but what right then happens? Go ahead.
Well, they realized that they sewed clothes because they realized they were naked, so shame came right away.
Good. Yeah. That realization, oops, we're in trouble. What we've done, not okay. What else are the immediate consequences? Go ahead.
Run and hide.
I'm sorry.
Run and hide.
Yeah, they ran, they hid, they were fearful. They once had a close friendship with God, walking with him in the cool of the day. I got a lot of questions. Remember, if people would have written this, we would have had a lot more detail. Right? What is that like? The closest we ever get again is, Moses and Abraham and people like that are friends of God sometimes, but walking along on a walk with God in the garden like you would with your child or something at night or something, that's awesome. But instead of that fellowship, they hear him and they run, they hide. Right? That loss of the closeness and the fear of what might happen. Good. Other immediate consequences.
I guess maybe a separation from
Yeah.
God. You suppose it later, but
Yeah.
death is a separation, and had to have been an immediate separation.
Yeah. That closeness cannot exist. That close fellowship, working together, relating to him in that way, that's gone. In fact, the only place that could have happened was in Eden, with those 4 rivers guarding the borders. And they're kicked out, and an angel with a flaming sword is put in the way, so they can't get back to that. There is a separation between them and closeness with God. Go ahead.
God asked them a question. They were accountable at that particular point.
Yeah.
They had to answer a question. They already knew the answer, but
Yeah.
like you say, that relationship now is different.
Yeah.
It's not an innocent, it's not a close relationship. They're having to explain themselves.
Yeah. And by the way, this is just something to think about. It's hard to kind of know when is a child ready to become a Christian. And I don't think there's one easy right answer for it. But it is going to be the point we decide this is no longer innocence, right? This is a moment here. Guilt comes when you know what you've done is wrong. You understand what you've done is wrong. You're able to fathom that what you did was wrong. And so, however we work on figuring that out, if someone's old enough or mature enough for that, this kind of shows us what the reactions can be, right? I see 2 more hands. Start Rick and then go back there.
They separated themselves from God. God didn't separate from them.
Okay.
Same as today. We separate ourselves from God. God is always there for us.
Yeah, he didn't sever that relationship. They did. Good.
they did what man had done from that time till now. You talk about accountability, they blame, we think they just blamed Eve, but he really in essence blamed God.
Yeah.
It wasn't, you know, it's the old adage, this is not my fault. If you would have not done such and such, this would not have happened. And so it's the blame game where we begin this, and it's still in existence to this day.
Yeah, you're right. As far as we know, this is the first time anyone ever had to accuse someone saying, it's not me, it's you. And whether it be, it's the snake, it's the woman. And they're essentially, like you said, blaming God. Well, God, if you wouldn't have given me this woman, then she never would have given me this fruit, and we'd all be okay right now. Whose fault is it really, you know? And so, sin begets more sin. This sin cycle enters. And it's ugly, right? So, there's a couple of other consequences we'll talk about as we go through. But I would like to talk more about how sin affects us and how it works on us in the wrong way. So the next story that's kind of included in this couple of chapters here is that of Cain and Abel. If you look in chapter 4 with me, this is a really important chapter. All of these are kind of like prototype stories that teach us, okay, this is how temptation works. This is how relating to brothers works. This is how family works. A lot of the stuff in Genesis kind of serves as introductions to a lot of these various topics. But Cain and Abel, we'll actually start with verse 1. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve and conceived and gave birth to Cain. She said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Again she gave birth to his brother Abel. Abel was the keeper of the flocks, but Cain was the tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel on his part also brought the firstlings of his flock, of their fat portions. The Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about, when they were in the field, Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? He said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Now you who are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from you, or from your hand. And he goes on and he curses him with this. But I want to talk specifically about how sin operates there. Because God gives a warning to Cain. And I thought I understood this until I had children. I didn't really understand it. Have you ever had the insight, because you know your child so well, you know what they are about to do, and you are doing everything in your power to stop that, because you are just tired of getting your kids in trouble, and you don't want to do it again, and you're like, son, I see what you're going to do, stop. Don't say any more, don't go any further, just walk away, don't touch that. Like, maybe I'm just in the middle of this. You guys have probably been there, you've probably seen that before, right? How does sin work here? What does he describe about it?
It's like a wild animal crouching behind the door to pounce.
Yeah. And if there was a wild animal on the other side of the door, I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to open that door. It's going to stay locked. What responsibility does he have here? What does it say?
To rule over that feeling.
You must master it. You must rule it. This goes back to the intention of God for mankind. In Genesis chapter 1, he says you are made in my image. You were to have dominion over creation. We talked about this a little bit this morning. We can tame all sorts of wild beasts, but what we seem to have trouble taming is our own tongue, our own spirit, our own lust, desires, anger, whatever. We can't control ourselves. And we have a choice. That's the biggest part of this, I think, is important. Okay, all the circumstances are there. It doesn't look good. Right now, you have a choice how you're going to react with how you feel. And I think feelings are natural. They're going to happen. We can't act like we're some cold, uncaring people that don't have feelings. We have feelings, but we are responsible for how we act or don't act on those feelings. Go ahead.
I think it took me a while to grasp too. Sin is looking for leverage. And when we came in, we give it to it. And we have the will to stop it. And if we don't see what it's doing, then the advantage doesn't goes away from us, and it goes to the thing that sin is trying to get us to do. And I think it's difficult for us to see that at times. But that's what it's gaining, is trying to get leverage to get an upper hand over us.
Yeah. And unfortunately, because the world we live in, the way it works, sin exists, it's here. And you can beat temptations for a while, but temptations of some sort are always going to be there. You must master it. Don't let it master you. Right? See?
This is the first death that's recorded for us, and it's a murder. Adam and Eve aren't in the story, but I can't think of this story without thinking about mom and dad seeing a child die. And under those circumstances, and Satan said, "You shall not surely die." And where do they see it? They see it in the family. They see it in a son. I can't imagine how that resonates in terms of God's creation, understanding what this death means.
Yeah. It's a sobering reality that there are consequences to how we parent or don't parent, how our kids see us live our lives. And the fact that death can be a result in this case. Because guess what? Adam and Eve, they had sin crouching at the door. They didn't master it, right? They let it become a master of them. And here, the same thing happens. You know? And Abel is the first really type of Christ, the righteous martyr that cries out from the grave. You know, he's used in Hebrews 11 as an example of faith. You know, all the things he didn't know and he didn't see, and yet he pleased God. I think there's a powerful concept to that. And yet, even throughout all of that, when he was faithful, he was rejected for it. You know, look for many themes around Genesis. There's so many themes in the book. But God's special chosen person being rejected by others. That's in the Joseph story we kind of talked about in our sermon this morning. That's in all throughout the book of Genesis, right? That God's people who are standing up and being faithful get rejected for standing up for the truth. So it's an ugly situation here. But I want to focus on that personal responsibility for sin. And sometimes people come back to this passage and say, well, we inherited this sin, so we can't help it. And they use this passage to say the exact opposite of what this passage is intended for. And whether that be from full-on original sin, you inherit some kind of flawed nature through your parentage, or whether it be like this what I call almost original sin light. You know, we just have this fallen nature. We can't help it. I've got this proclivity. You know, I don't know if there's an alcoholic gene. I don't know if there's a gene that makes someone lean more towards one type of, sin or another. But even if it were true, those things are still not an excuse, because what does God say? You must master it. It doesn't master you. Humans are over creation, and that includes us. And so many times we play that victim card that I couldn't help it. It happened to me. And I'll tell you, I started this early on with my kids. It fell over. No, you knocked it over. I'm not mad at you, but I'm going to correct your language. You knocked it over. You spilled it. It spilled. No, it didn't spill. You spilled it. from an early age, teaching children, okay, I made a mess, I'll clean up. That becomes more helpful when it comes to, I made a spiritual mess. I got to get this cleaned up, right? Because we don't like to take personal blame. We're afraid of punishment. God's going to cover sins if we trust Him. But we've got to step up and take some personal responsibility here, right? And God, if He came to you and said, hey, tonight you've got this temptation, it's getting ready to overtake you, here's my personal warning for you. You'd like to think that'd be enough to keep you from accepting, or from rejecting Him, right? This passage shows us that even that, if you are dead set on disobeying God, you're going to disobey God. I don't care if it's the best sermon you've ever heard. I don't care if the elders come and visit you personally. If you don't want to do what's right, you're not going to do what's right. So maybe for us teachers, sometimes we need to realize, okay, they chose. They knew better and they chose. But also, if the elders don't visit you the way you like, or the preacher doesn't preach like you like, or the church doesn't encourage you the way you like, you can't just blame them. You have to say, nope, I did that. And so all of these stories kind of reflect that. Instead of pushing blame off on somebody else, accept the blame. Nope, I'm feeling this. I did this. I've got a problem. Anyway, just my soapbox there for a second. Do you guys have any other thoughts on that? Really just how Satan works and how sin works in our life. There is the good part of, there's definitely the curses that come along with sin, but there's the promise of good in the future. What was the promise to Eve? Genesis 3.
Seed promise.
Good. Yeah, we call it the seed promise that, so your seed, the Satan's seed basically is going to be stomped on the head by woman's seed. So his heel will be bruised, but I'd rather have a messed up foot than my head squished in. Right? That's kind of the picture here. This is really the very first direct promise of a Messiah to come. Before that, there wasn't a need for that because sin didn't enter the world. But right away, God promises. Now, there's a couple of things. Names matter. And I could spend all day talking about names that matter in Genesis. But I'm just going to give two of them that are pretty cool. First of all, look in chapter 4, verse 1. I already read this. I've always wondered if Eve might have thought Cain's the one to help us out of this problem. You notice she gave his name. I gave birth to Cain. I've gotten a man-child. Mine supplies some italics, with the help of the Lord. Man-child with the Lord, perhaps, something like that. She might think this is the guy who might deliver us. And his very name kind of means that. I wonder if that's the first child she has after the promise was made. Hey, maybe he's the one to fix the problem. That explains why she's so disappointed at the end of chapter 4 when they realize, yeah, Cain and Abel, they aren't going to be the ones. And so they have Seth, and Seth is someone who now their new hope is coming through. But the coolest one, to me, is in chapter 5 when Noah is named. And I wonder what his dad even understood. Genesis chapter 5 and verse 29. Actually, I'm going to start in verse 28. Lamech lived 182 years, became the father of a son. He called his name Noah, saying, "This one will give us rest from our work, from the toil of our hands, arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed." I don't have any reason to believe Lamech was a strong, faithful believer, but at least he knew the promise enough to say, we've got this curse that gives us toil and hard work, and maybe, just maybe, my son will be the one to bring about rest from this curse. So they were already looking for it. And the way they named their children, the hope that they provided, they were looking for that salvation came. Which I think that's just really cool. And Noah is kind of a prototype of Jesus. In many ways, he does some great faithful things. He saves people by water. Now people are punished by water at the same time, but there is that comparison made really in 1 Peter chapter 3 between what Noah does. But they were already looking for the rest that comes from these curses. I think we're so separated sometimes from where our food comes from that we don't really appreciate the real curse of, that punishment. But imagine if you wouldn't eat if your crops failed. Maybe some of you in some place of your life were like that. For most of us, that's not been the reality. That's intense, right? You can't say, well, I just don't have a green thumb. I guess I won't grow anything. You don't eat. Bad farmers die. So they wanted rest from that. And they didn't have all sorts of fancy tools and farm implements and whatever else they've come up with nowadays. They didn't have a grocery store. They'd go down and get some kind of produce. If your crops failed, you died. They wanted rest. However, I bet most people are kind of like tired of going to jobs that they don't like. So maybe our curse is transformed a little bit. We're not digging in the soil, but we are sometimes stuck in jobs or careers or just working to pay the bills in ways that we would rather not do, but we have to. And we drag ourselves up to do it again and again and again, right? We're in that endless cycle. So they were looking for rest. They wanted it. We wanted to. Do you guys have any thoughts? I just thought that was interesting. Wanted to point out the names, how they were already looking for it early on. All right. Let's talk about Noah. What was the world like when Noah, I guess the world Noah was born into? Really, chapter 6 highlights a lot of this.
Man's hearts were willing evil continuously.
Yeah. People's hearts were focused on doing evil continuously. Now, I believe our world's in a dark place right now. It seems like news stories are dark and war after war happening. There's been a whole lot more years with wars in them than without wars if you look in history. There's bad stuff that happens out there, right? But I can't imagine a world where everyone's thoughts are always, how can I do more evil? Because even people in the world that I meet, there's some good-hearted people out there, right? And maybe they're misguided, maybe they don't know all the truth, but they're good neighbors. I've got some good neighbors, right? This world is one that we can't fathom just how bad it was. And I know we complain, every generation says, our generation is going off the deep end, we're the worst generation that's ever existed. Come on. God has not sent fire yet, so you're not there yet. You'll know if you're in the worst generation ever because that's when fire and brimstone are going to melt the earth with an intense heat. We're not there yet. Describe Noah. What was Noah like?
Righteous man.
Absolutely. He's righteous. What does it feel like to be righteous but surrounded by wickedness?
Very frustrating. When your 3-year-old is throwing a temper tantrum.
It's unpleasant. It's uncomfortable. It's lonely. One thing that was tough when I lived up in the UP was that I felt isolated from a lot of people who believed the same way that I did. And so I was calling people and texting people, and anytime I could visit people, I was just so refreshed because I realized I need some people who think like I do and love God the same level that I do, right? Being lonely, like I feel like I'm the only one sometimes. That's tough. We don't know the level Noah was at. Even if you compare like faithful Christians in Porter County to those that are not faithful, like we're still a much better average than that. One versus the world. So this was rough. I know it's a different story, but Peter, in a similar account, talks about how Lot's righteous soul was tormented every day as he dwelt among it. Saw it all around him. It was even creeping into his family. And he saw his wife and daughters doing some evil stuff, and his daughters marrying evil guys. It's torment to watch that bad stuff happen all around you, and you stand up. He's a preacher of righteousness, Scripture calls him, and nobody wants to hear it. But he did it anyway. And I find zero mentions of him growing weary or tired in what he's doing. He's faithful despite the world going in a totally different direction. That's hard. So maybe lessons for us. Latch on to who you have here, because that's great. And why don't we do that more? Like, sometimes those who are best friends in the world, you need to be in the world. You need to have friends in the world. But your best friends in the world should be people who love Jesus the way you do. Think about it. But Noah did the right thing even though everyone else did not. And by the way, from what I understand in calculating the ages, I don't think his kids were born yet. God says what to Noah? What's his command?
Build an ark.
Build an ark. It's a big box. It's not some fancy ship. It's not some fancy thing like that. I've been to the Ark experience down in Kentucky, which is cool, just to kind of maybe visualize something. I'm not sure. That's some representation in some ways of how it could have been, perhaps. I don't know. There's a lot of unknowns in this situation. But he says, do something. It's a large something. This is a task that's going to take him a lot of years, right? I believe something like 120 years. He tells them exactly what to do, how to do it. Describe Noah's obedience.
He did all that the Lord told him to.
Did everything the Lord commanded, right? There's actually 3 mentions of it in Scripture. 6:22, thus Noah did according to all that God had commanded him, so he did. Chapter 7, verse 5, Noah did according to all the Lord had commanded him. Verse 16, those that entered, male and female, all flesh had entered as God commanded him, and the Lord closed behind him. So, he completely followed God's instructions all the way. That is faith. Noah is used in Hebrews 11 as somebody who acted upon faith, because faith is something when we obey based on things we haven't seen, but we still trust anyway. What are some things that Noah had never seen? Rain. Go back and look at chapter 2 of Genesis. The earth was watered with a mist that came up out of the ground. God watered the earth different. Rain had never fallen before. And God says, I'm going to make so much water come out of the sky, even though these waters are separated, that it's going to flood the whole earth. He'd never seen a global flood, let alone a flood of any sort. And yet, there is no questioning. There is no, well, what about this, or what about that? Nope, okay, God said do it, I do it. And no one else helped him, no one else around him. It was him. And when his sons came of age, I'm sure they worked on the ark with him. But 8 persons were saved in that ark. Would you call Noah a successful preacher?
Yes.
I would say he is. What is the preacher's job? Yeah, tell the truth, preach the word, be ready in season, out of season. I think it was definitely out of season there. that was not the season of listening to the word. You know, if Noah would have been a bad preacher, he would have said nothing. Their reaction has nothing to do with whether or not you're a good preacher. And we measure it that way, don't we? I've heard of churches firing preachers because numbers shrank, or they didn't grow at fast enough rate, or things like that. Things they can tally up on a board. Now, if your preacher stops preaching the whole truth, okay, then you start talking, okay, you're going to stick here or not? You're going to change the things or not? But if your preacher's teaching the whole truth and doing their job, we look at results wrong. Ezekiel, by the way, was also told by God, no one's going to listen to you. Jeremiah was told, no one's going to listen to you. Do it anyway. Both of them were told, I'm going to give you a harder head than them. A hard-headed preacher is what you want. So I would say Noah was successful because he spoke what he had to speak to whoever would listen, regardless of the results. He didn't change the message. Bad pun, didn't water it down. He did what he was supposed to do, right? I want to end with this idea, and I know, I think we'll go to 550 or 545? 45, okay. I got 2 minutes. So if you have something really important to say, I guess save it for tomorrow. I want to point out how all these stories involve sacrifice. Adam and Eve. What did God have to do to clothe them in the garden? He killed an animal. They were made of animal skins, the clothing they wore. Something had to die to cover Adam and Eve's sin. Very next story. What did Cain and Abel have to do? They have to offer sacrifices to God. And things have to die. And you get to Noah's story, and what does he specifically do? All the clean animals that are worthy of doing sacrifices, he puts more on the boat to make sure there's enough sacrifice-worthy animals. And what's the very first thing Noah does when he comes off the ark? Sacrifices. So if we're talking about the fall and sin and the curse, understand sin brings death. Something has to die. But the hopeful concept is if a sacrifice is made that is pleasing to God, it doesn't have to be us, at least eternal in that sense. The price is paid, often by God doing some things, so that people can live. And you want to be on God's side, worshiping God in His way, so that you may live, despite what happens. All the big stories of Genesis are going to end up involving sacrifice too. Because it's that important. It's a concept they were very familiar with. So hopefully we'll notice that as we look through, especially some of Abraham's story. Final thoughts or comments? These classes go by too quick. Thanks, everybody.